Hello everyone, today we will talk about Kierkegaard and his period, the very beginning of modernity. So Kierkegaard is a rather complex thinker, so we can't just summarize his philosophy in 7 points. So we'd better just put his idea into his age and also to compare his ideas with that of others, so that we can get a clear understanding of what his works are about and also how himself considers of his authorship and his works. So first of all, modernity is considered as the very beginning of modern philosophy, and also this is a period of radical social and cultural change, and it has also brought about many problems to society and individuals that until this day still need to be solved. The birth of modernity in philosophy can be properly stated with Kierkegaard philosophy. So among the early modernity thinkers, that is Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Marx, they share some common points. That is, they also want to answer to the problem of modernity and to solve it. But so chronologically and also according to their own dealing with this problem of modernity, Kierkegaard can be considered as the first philosopher. Now, the very beginning, I want to talk about the diagnosis of modernity. So, since it is still something like an unsolved problem, so the diagnosis, the definition of modernity becomes very important. And also, we can see from this that it is deeply connected in several aspects, including social, cultural, and also individual changes. And this provides the basic background for philosophers' thinking. So, since it begins roughly with the Romantic period, and we can consider it historically as a period out of the Victoria. So, we can see here from this painting from Goya, and he depicts the dark sides of Victoria period. So compared to this, the Romantic period is something as a self-free for social intellectuals, and also as an essential advancement in both society and cultural aspects. And also one very important part is about its technological developments, so this can result in other economical and cultural developments. And we can see from this period, technology is playing a more and more important role uh, in social change and also to affect our thinkers' thoughts. So here, what is shown is Shelley's novel Frankenstein, the first edition of the cover. And so this not fiction at the very beginning of modernity and shows the possible worries and about the possible devastating consequences that technologies can and possibly bring about. And it is actually at the beginning as something like a warning to people of the modern age. Now, apart from these technological and social changes, what is very important here is that the Romantics put an emphasis on the individual and especially on the expression of the individual. That is, their own thoughts, their emotions becomes very important in comparison with religious beliefs and also the policies from officials. So here we can talk about the artistic aspect of modernity. So for the artists, they especially put this emphasis for expression and against all the depression in the past centuries, especially from the dark ages of the medieval Europe. And so in 1824, Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony, the Choral, a very famous symphony, and also is later used as something like a symbol for the cooperation and the union of the whole of Europe. So Beethoven's music is in its designation very radical and revolutionary, but at its basis is the romantic pursuit of the call for expression. And we can also see here from the painting of Delacroix, his famous painting of Liberty Leading the People from 1830. So here the painter combines the social changes with his own way of expression painting, and also this is a sign of radical social changes, and also shows people's hope at that time for a better and perhaps more equal and democratic society. And so Baudelaire is also a forerunner of modernity, and his famous collection Paris Spleen was written in 1869. So compared to the previous two works, this is rather late, but it is important because it shows several aspects of Romantic society, and also since at that time the Romantic society has been developed for several decades, so he can get a rather comprehensive overview of it and to point out the very the many problems and also rather annoying consequences that romantics has brought about. Now, having said that, so we can see that modernity begins with this reflection and this requiring of the expression of the individual, and this is something that separate modernity completely with previous ages, and also what the problems it has brought about, like nihilism, which we will talk about later, all concerns with the status of individuals and how themselves can communicate with the world and how to find their own meaning and their status in this world. But essentially, at the very beginning of modernity, as Kierkegaard says here, it shows two aspects. And the first is that the new must forge ahead, and the second is that the old must be displaced. And so at that time, this was a quite a radical movement, and we can see here that the expression of historicity is the very firm call for the replacement of the old, and for the newer generation to create their own age. Now here is another two quotes from Heiberg, an intellectual from Denmark who is at the same age of Kierkegaard. And so here he diagnoses two very important aspects of modernity. In the first quote, he says that modernity, this period goes from past ages, which had lost all meaning in the present. Here he talks about meaning, which would become very important for existentialists. Meanings here seems to be lost since modernity because there doesn't exist a shared standard anymore. From the second quote, he says that people of all age are left abandoned by all gods since the entire world of gods is dead. So here is another diagnosis of the death of God, which we will see is very profound in Nietzsche's philosophy. So here we shouldn't take the official meaning of this sentence. So that's not only people's turning away from Christian faith, but in a larger point, the Christian faith in Europe implicated the people's basis for their belief, for their knowledge, and their way of life. So since that was destroyed, this becomes a very serious problem for everyone, not only the intellectuals and the philosophers. Now here we are talking about the very motto of modernity. This begins with Nietzsche in his book, the Zarathustra, he says that could this be possible? This holy man in his forest has heard nothing of this year, but God is dead. So we can see from other analysis that the Romantics put an emphasis on the individual, and they want to explore the inward dimension of a person. So this can be compared to a Christian believer who is also seeking the inwardness of their own ego. But as Nietzsche says here, the Christian just turns him away from others and goes into the forest, and by so doing, he believes that he can get a clear understanding of also closer to the God. But Nietzsche says here is that the social changes has been so radical that you can't just avoid it and live in your own church or other things, and just to keep yourself from all these changes. From this moment, the person is in a way and has a much deeper connection with the world, because the world itself is more connected, as we can see from the colonization from an earlier period. So international communication is not something like imagination anymore. It becomes reality. So we can summarize this quote we have seen here as the death of God. This indicates at the beginning of a new age, and which is essentially different in nature with that of the Christian. So we can summarize the old age as the age of faith, since people from the past period bases their belief completely on the God. And now, since they don't have a firm basis to have their belief, and they have to rely on themselves. So the direct consequences is what we call nihilism. So this is an age without faith, and we can see from Heber's quote that we are abandoned by all gods. And so this age of negation, on the other hand, we can see that it cannot be turned back. So if we have stepped into modernity, we can never go back to the age of God. And I also want to mention that nihilism is first used by Müller, and Kierkegaard's own mentor, a very famous Danish philosopher. So here he says that it necessarily ends in an absence of all content, in a moral nihilism. Now, Müller is a very insightful thinker, so although he was away from the center of intellect in Europe at that time, so that of Germany and the cities of Hegel and Schopenhauer, but he was still insightful in diagnosing the very nature of modernity. And so Kierkegaard was greatly influenced by him, and in a way pursued the unfinished project by his mentor. So we can hear from this evidence states that Kierkegaard is the very first philosopher to discuss modernity. Because as we can see here, Müller's discussion is about moral nihilism. So what he observes here is essentially at the first beginning an abandonment of past moralities. And so the common beliefs is replaced in spite of recent radical changes. And so we can also put an emphasis of our talk here upon the person in the world. So we should consider themselves as an entity in the world, as in spite of all the things in the world, the one must find his own meaning in the world, and also to live their own life instead of relying on religious beliefs, on other people's requests or other things. Now, a very important development in philosophical methodology at that time is, as I put here, the Socratic method. So this was already used by Socrates, and he was a very popular philosopher of discussion for these philosophers. So, for example, Kierkegaard recognized Socrates, as we will see later, as the model for his own philosophical project. And also Nietzsche, in discussing about the origin of the Greek tragedy, also talks about Socrates' irreplaceable status in the development of the Greek society. And so we begin with this a part of ancient philosophy, so that exists in Plato's apparatic dialogues. And so the apparatic here is our main focus. So as we can see, and is emphasized by Kierkegaard, Socrates is in nature a negative thinker. He asks people about their own knowledge, or at least as they believe. And he claims that he knows nothing and want to learn from these aristocrats and other social intellectuals. But according to his questioning, other people find that it is very difficult to define what they know. So in the end, they have to admit that they know nothing, just like Socrates, and they are even more ignorant because Socrates knows that he knows nothing, but other people think they know many things, but in fact, they know nothing. So here, every Plato's dialogues more or less end with what is originally called aporia. So this can be considered as a very important turning point of philosophy. So although Socrates' influence will become eminent in centuries later, but we can see here, so a philosophical dialogue doesn't need to reap any fruitful discussions. And sometimes the discussion itself can become the most important part, can take a meaning itself. So Socrates' aporia here gives insights into our thinking of philosophy and our very way of doing it. And now go back to modernity, and I want to focus on the modern dialectic. So it begins with the Enlightenment philosopher Kant, who was very important and also resulted later in the division for continental philosophy and analytical philosophy as we see today. So in his designation, Kant put this tripartite design of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis to complete his grand project of the three critics. And although we can consider this as Kant's own philosophical development, so at first he talked about pure reason, and then he found that he need to take into consideration other social influence on the people. So he talked about practical reason. And on the last, which is very important, especially to the Romantics, is the very recognition of aesthetics. So this leads to Kant's third critic, the critic of the power of judgment, and also to his synthesis to unite the thesis and the antithesis in a higher degree. So this is revolutionized from Socratic concept and also plays a very important role itself in modern philosophy. So as we can see, not only Kant, but the next generation of him, Hegel and Schopenhauer, also used this as a very important thing to tackle modernity. So for Hegel, for example, he says that every pair of dialectics can be mediated. He believes in the mediation of every such opposing terms, so that there, in general, the dichotomy can be eliminated, and also we can get a firm conclusion in the end. So the next generation of Hegel and Schopenhauer And so it is about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. We also make use of this modern dialectic. So, for example, Kierkegaard's own ironies, which he associated with Socrates, is something of a reflecting nature, and he used it as a tool in his philosophy to talk about modernity and also his reflections on religion and other thinkings. So for Nietzsche, this can be seen as an overcoming, although it at first doesn't seem to be very clear. But we can see here that the overcoming, as Nietzsche's book claims, is beyond good and evil. So these two opposing terms can be seen as the thesis and antithesis in terms of morality. But we can see in the death of God, the morality of the age is completely destroyed. So what we are left here is, of course, ourselves. But if we want to unite them to find, again, a complete ego of ourselves, we need to go beyond that level of morality and to focus on life itself. So, begins with Nietzsche, the very notion of moral philosophy ends. And now we talk about philosophy of life, which will become very important also to some existentialist figures such as Camus. So, we have talked about the general idea that provides the background for the early modernity thinkers. And one thing that is very important is that despite their radical nature, they actually haven't relied on the classics and also past figures. And that is, they essentially make a dialogue with the past figures instead of, as we will see later, a more radical attitude and a hostile one towards classicalness. So for Kierkegaard here, so as we have said, he's a very complex thinker, but there are several eminent figures that has cast a profound influence on Kierkegaard. So here he says that the only analogy I have before me is Socrates. So Kierkegaard considers his own philosophy as a Socratic task, and also he considers himself in terms of theological and religious thinkings, the very Socrates of Denmark. And although we can see that Kierkegaard's interpretation of Socrates is heavily influenced by Hegel, as we will talk about later, but still Socrates is very important to him, and he studied classics, so we can see that he has direct acquaintance with these Greek classics. And we can also see from his philosophy that it contains definitely a negative nature, so this resemblance closely to Socrates' philosophy. Now for Nietzsche, and apart from the philosophers, I want to first talk about Wagner. So Nietzsche himself also developed to combine music with philosophy. So for him, art is a very important aspect of life and also very important for his own intellectual development and his philosophy. And of course, we can recall the rather dramatic and controversial relationship with Wagner. So at first, Nietzsche admired Wagner above all others and considers him as the future of art in his own age. Here he says that Wagner was naturally the greatest help to me above all, as an exemplar ungraspable by past aesthetics. This is above all a matter of getting beyond the Lysing's form, which one can hardly dare say without inner anxiety and shame. So here Nietzsche diagnosed Wagner as the artist of the future, and also he sees in Lessing's analysis the limitations of individual art forms. But Nietzsche believes that we can, in dealing with our own life, to combine all these art forms into something. And we can later say that this is Nietzsche's music drama. And he believes that Wagner is the very tragedy of his own age and can produce the very perfect music drama to him. But later we can see that in terms of religious and racial beliefs, Nietzsche is actually quite different from Wagner. And we can even say that Nietzsche is a revolutionary philosopher, but on the other hand, Wagner is like an evil genius. So finally, in the last years of his active authorship, he ends up with a very hostile attitude towards Wagner, and this lasted until the death of Nietzsche. Here, the quote is, "Finally, this music, which refers to Bizet's command, is the counterpart of Wagner, who was, whatever else he was, at any rate, the most impolite genius of the world." So here, of course, we can say that Wagner is a genius and was very influential as both practitioner and also a theorist of the age. But Nietzsche diagnosed the very negative factor that is actually prevailing in all Wagner's works. And after he has tripped to Southern Europe, which he calls like the sunny and lively South, so he was deeply impressed by Bizet's Carmen, and at a time described it as the greatest opera he has ever seen. So Nietzsche can trust this very dynamic, passionate, and also positive opera to that of Wagner's, like the Ring Cycle. And Nietzsche got to the conclusion that Wagner's works were prevailed by negativity, and what he wants is a positive philosopher who be nurtured by him and also by the future generations. So apart from Wagner, which was quite controversial, and also to Nietzsche himself, and his relationship with Schopenhauer can be described more culturally. So he was greatly influenced by the German philosopher and also took great sources from Schopenhauer. But at last, Nietzsche developed a positive philosophy, but we can still see that Nietzsche shares many points and can be considered as an inherent to Schopenhauer. Here in his poem just named after Schopenhauer, he says, quote, "What he taught is settled, how he lived will stand. Look at him, he is subject to no one." So for Nietzsche, this is a very complimenting attitude towards Schopenhauer, and we can see that he's really grateful to his own professor. Now we talk about the last figure in our chronological order, Marx. So for Marx, he was also greatly influenced by Hegel, and we can see that although his criticisms of Hegel is rather complicated, but it takes this world historical perspective on the progress of history and also on the development of the human intellect. Here he says, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Now this is a very famous quote, and we can see here Marx's philosophy as a rather reactive and quite dynamic, and is closely associated directly with social change. This separates him from other philosophers, and we can even say that he's more like a social reformer instead of like a pure philosopher. And so Marx's point here is that he already contains a critique of the metaphysical nature of some philosophical discussions, which are negative and is completely deprived of the world from reality. Now, having said that, we can conclude by this Nietzsche's quote, "Thus begin Zarathustra's going under." We can see that although the Romantic artists would emphasize on the authenticity and also passion of their own works, they don't want to put themselves apart from the world, apart from society. On the other hand, they want to change it by their own efforts, and also they want to become part of it so that they can receive those sources constantly from other people. And this can be seen also in many other writers like Baudelaire and even Camus. So he says that he never want to distance himself from the public, and he thinks the artist should never do so. So for Nietzsche, although here Zarathustra took something like the role of Jesus and want to teach other people, but in fact this going under is also his own choice, and he considers this as a very important further step apart from his 30 years in solitude, and as the next step to his own development. Now we go on to talk about nihilism itself. So of course it can take many names like nihilism, or Camus' absurdity, or Kierkegaard's irony, or like that of Sartre and Beauvoir, existentialism, or the crisis of modern society. But whatever the name it takes, as we have said, the nature remains the same. And also we can say that the artists and the philosophers' attempt to solve the problem are actually in a way quite same in their direction. And they want to find back the meaning and autonomy of the individual so that the individual don't need to be puzzled and become very isolated in the world and finds no meaning whatsoever to his or her own life. But we can see here the romantic attitude inspired by nihilism is actually like in a turning point. So it is quite different from the previous generation, especially that of the Enlightenment thinkers. Here, as Winckelmann says, quote, "The idea of lofty beauty cannot be conceived otherwise than when the soul is wrapped in quiet meditation and abstract from all individuality of shape." So Winckelmann was a very important Enlightenment figure, and also Lessing was very influential. So their ideas consist in the critique of the ancient Greek arts, and they considered that as the ideal for all art forms. So here, and this idea of abstract from all individuality of shape can directly compared with Plato's distinction between form and content. And Winckelmann here says that one very important aspect is about the universal factor in terms of the artwork. And so an artwork must be beauty in itself. And also he talks about quiet meditation, which is very important and is described by Lessing as stillness. So they see this as a quite important aspect of the Greek sculptor, and then they applied this to all the other analysis and to claim it as a very outstanding characteristic of all arts. Now, if we compare this Enlightenment aesthetic with that of the Romantic and of early modernity, so here is a Kierkegaard's quote. First, philosophy begins with doubt. Second, in order to philosophize, one must have doubted. Third, modern philosophy begins with doubt. If we want to talk about skepticism in the modern sense, we usually begins with Descartes, but there was thousands of years ago skepticism in Greek philosophy and that of Pyrrho. So that was like skepticism is for its own sake, and although Descartes is much more influential, and as we have seen from the nature of nihilism, so this certain doubting factor is explained by Kierkegaard here. But in the second sentence, he emphasizes on to philosophize, which is very important, and is used by Nietzsche to imply the essential connection between the philosopher and their own life. So this would later become the philosophy of life. And also, we can see that whoever does philosophy, there already contains a self-reflecting and doubting factor so that he can initiate his own philosophical study. So we can see that philosophy is both universal and particular in a sense. And also to this particular sense, we always begin with doubt. And when you can doubt everything, then it can be said as a proper beginning of philosophizing. And also the sentence, modern philosophy begins with doubt, is of course a description of the early modernity. But as we have said, the early modernity thinkers have this relationship with past classics. So their way to deal with it is to make use of them, to let them become like localized and be used in their own age instead of completely abandon them, as we can see from the pursuit of futurists. So here is the Marinetti quote: "Museums, cemeteries, truly identical in their sinister juxtaposition of bodies that do not know each other." So we can see here that Marinetti and other futurists take a very different and actually the most radical and hostile attitude towards classics. They consider even museums and galleries as something like the cemeteries of artworks instead of a place exhibiting the past greatness. And they consider the world of art as a battlefield, and they would want to fight in it as the soldiers fought, and they will ultimately replaced by the next generation. So we can see from the futurist that this is something like a Darwinian struggle and evolution, and art is not considered as like a fluid and continuous, and each and every historical figure contributes his or her own share to the greatness of art. But instead, this is a battlefield, and everyone takes his own part and will be beaten when he or she becomes old. And so we have seen the Futurist Manifesto. Now we turn to Kierkegaard's quotes again. We now begin to discuss what does it mean with this doubt. So for the modernity thinkers, this doubt can be interpreted in another meaning apart from its pure meaning itself, as is exemplified by the skeptics. So here, this doubt is an essential reflection and also the proper way of doing philosophy. And we can see from Kierkegaard's own philosophy and his admiration of Socrates' negative philosophy, this doubt can be interpreted as in the designation of the tripartite design of Kant as remaining in that contrast of the thesis and the antithesis, and not going beyond that to conclude the synthesis. Here we turn to a very important concept in ancient philosophy, that of no more. Although this is not much emphasized in modern philosophy, but this is quite important in our very understanding of doubt. So consequently, it is very important in our understanding of modernity. And no more here for the ancient philosophers was like a shared topic and shared technical term for everyone in that academic sphere. And let's first see an example to see how the ancient philosophers used this concept. So here in Pyrrho's fragment, it is indicated, quote, "Man do everything on the basis of convention and habit, for each thing is no more this than this." So Pyrrho's conception of convention and habit is rather complicated, but what is clear here is that he indicates that the entity's autonomy is represented by itself. So other things like properties other people perceive or its use in terms of utility are not something belongs to itself. And when we talk about itself, so any other things like the understanding of it or an example of it cannot be truer than it. So here, it's like a metaphysical concern about the use of no more. Having said that, we can say that what is emphasized often by modern thinkers is this a further step. So this can be considered as the very negation of the no more conception, and also to turning towards the synthesis. And sometimes they don't even come up with the synthesis, but they just want to take a step more. And of course, they can just make things even worse. And of course, this has a very long tradition with skepticism, and here we can see Descartes' quote, "De omnibus dubitandum." So here he says you must doubt everything, and this is a very proper beginning of philosophy. And we can see here he's only talking about doubt, so there's no further step yet in his designation. Now we look at another Pyrrhus quote. None of us knows anything, not even this very thing, whether we know or don't know. I think actually this is much clearer and actually goes much further than Descartes. And Pyrrhus here says that we must doubt everything, and this doubting itself even becomes doubted. And Pyrrhus, unlike Descartes, doesn't claim that the doubting self is the only undoubted. Further, he says that everything is doubted, and even although the thing itself is no more than this, but we can still we can't conclude that the doubting self is the only undoubted. So everything in the world is doubted, and actually. And the Pyrrhonian philosophy didn't just end with this and to take a completely pessimistic and negative view. On the contrary, they said that this very doubting without the confirmation of anything is the true meaning of their own philosophy and can be taken as the meaning of life. And so for Descartes, he needs a basis and a starting point, and this is his doubting self. But for the Pyrrhonian, they don't need anything, and this doubting itself becomes the very confirmation to the existence and also becomes meaningful in itself. And we can interpret this as the doubting is no more this than this.